the 21st of January, 1793, King Louis XVI of France was led to the guillotine. The revolutionary killing machine, which had just been introduced to humanize and industrialize the process of execution. Everything was done to rob Louis of his dignity, both as a king and as a human being. He was condemned as a mere citizen, Louis Capet. His hair was roughly cropped on the scaffold, and he was ignominiously strapped to a movable plank before having his head and neck thrust beneath the 12-inch, heavily weighted blade. Once severed, the bleeding head was held up to the mob before head and body were buried 10 feet deep in quicklime. Few foreign events have provoked such horror in England. Audiences demanded that the curtain be brought down in theatres and the performance abandoned. The whole House of Commons wore mourning, and crowds surrounded King George III's coach, crying, "War with France." Instead, the French seized the initiative. On the 1st of February 1793, the new Republic declared war on Britain. The war lasted 18 years, cost more in men and money than any before, and rewrote the rules of politics. Henceforward, monarchies would be measured by their ability to respond to this new post-revolutionary world. Those which could adapt survived. Those which could not died, usually bloodily. Which the British monarchy would do was by no means a foregone conclusion. In 1789, when the Bastille was stormed and the revolution broke out, nothing seemed less likely in Britain than a cataclysmic war with France. There was, for instance, no comment from the normally voluble King George III. But then, he was only just recovering from his first bout of madness when he'd been subject to a brutal cure by the mad doctors here at Kew. By August, however, George's wife, Queen Charlotte, was reacting with a horrified sympathy to the mounting humiliation of the French royal family.
France furnishes melancholy news. I often think that this cannot be the 18th century in which we live at present, where ancient history can hardly produce anything more barbarous and cruel than our neighbours in France.
But much of the political elite welcomed the revolution, which they saw in terms of France belatedly catching up with Britain's own glorious revolution of 1689, when Parliament had imposed legal limitations on the monarchy. One man who did not join in the cheers was Edmund Burke, MP. Crucial was Burke's interest in the sublime. This he defined as a young man in a pioneering essay as a sort of delightful horror, a tranquility tinged with terror that we get from the contemplation of darkness, danger, and death. If the restraining bonds of custom and tradition were cut, violence and terror might also exert a powerful and dangerous attraction in politics. It was this insight which enabled Burke to grasp, long before anyone else, the enormity of the French Revolution, and it turned him from politician to prophet. Burke published his Reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790, 3 years before the execution of Louis XVI. The revolution was then barely a year old. The Bastille had fallen. absolutism and feudalism had been abolished and the rights of man proclaimed. But the terror, the abolition of the monarchy, the revolutionary wars that convulsed Europe and led to the deaths of millions still lay in the future. Burke, however, prophesied them all. He correctly identified the governing principle of the revolution as an abstract, inhuman reason that thought that it could and should remodel society, politics, even humanity itself from scratch. This levelling reason saw history, habit and tradition as mere obstacles to progress that, like any human opposition, were to be destroyed in a joyous, all-consuming bonfire of the vanities. For Burke, on the other hand, history and tradition were the foundation of civilization, and habit the thing that made us human. From time to time, they might need reform. But it was reform that should preserve, not destroy, their essence. Monarchy, as a supreme embodiment of history and tradition, thus became a test case. Was it the key obstacle to the forging of a new world, as the French maintained? Or was it the guarantor of stability, as the British had decided in 1689? Burke urged his generation to stick by the principles of that earlier, sounder revolution. When he wrote the Reflections, he was a voice crying in the wilderness. But over the next few years, public opinion swung increasingly strongly in his direction. George, the Prince of Wales, the eldest son of George III, was the barometer of fashion. Handsome before he ran to fat, intelligent, charming, sensual, and a brilliant mimic, his relations with his father followed the usual Hanoverian pattern of mutual loathing and contempt. He thought his father mean and puritanical. His father thought his son a wanton and a wastrel. The Prince of Wales also followed the traditions of his house by putting himself at the head of the opposition party of radical Whigs, led by Charles James Fox. Burke had once been their leading ideologue. At first, the Prince dismissed the Reflections as a farrago of nonsense, but as the killings in France multiplied, he changed his mind about Burke and about his father. He made his peace with the king, broke with the opposition, and declared his enthusiastic support for the Tory Prime Minister. He even toyed with the idea of serving as a volunteer in the war against France. The Prince led the flight away from the implications of the revolution. Much of the Whig party followed, joining the Tory Prime Minister in a coalition to wage war under the standard of an hereditary monarchy against Republican France and all that she stood for. This increasingly ideological war condemned the Whigs to the wilderness for more than a generation. The great beneficiary was the monarchy. For much of his reign, George III could do no right. Now, increasingly living here at his favourite residence of Windsor Castle, he could do no wrong. Indeed, the less he did, the better, as he turned, in the popular mind at least, from a meddlesome, would-be absolutist into the benign father of his people, uxorious, moral, modest, frugal, and the very embodiment of a modern 18th century monarch. The result was the astonishing popular success of his Golden Jubilee on the 25th of October, 1810. But that very day, George, who'd already suffered from 2 mysterious episodes of apparent mental illness, began his permanent and irreversible descent into a twilight world of blindness and deranged senility. At the time of his father's collapse, the Prince of Wales, disrespectfully known as Prinny to his cronies, was already 48, under the combined influences of drink, drugs like the opium compound laudanum, and a gargantuan appetite. His youthful good looks were fading fast, and his skin had turned a deep, coppery hue. He spent gigantically too, the pavilion he built at Brighton being the most gorgeous example of his taste for excess. His own treasurer declared that his debts were beyond all kind of calculation whatever. But worst of all was his disastrous marriage. The marriage began hopefully as part of the closing of ranks within the royal family in the wake of the French Revolution. In return for the payment of his debts, the prince agreed to George III's urgent wish that he should marry and father an heir. German custom, however, dictated that his bride should be royal too. Best of a bad bunch of available Protestant princesses seemed to be his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. But when she arrived in England, it was loathing at first sight. She was coarse, ill-educated, and none too clean. After his marriage in the Chapel Royal at St. James's, George knocked himself out with brandy and spent his wedding night with his head in the hearth. The following morning, however, he'd recovered sufficiently to get Caroline pregnant, and a daughter christened Charlotte was born in January 1796. It was the first and the last time that the couple slept together, and they quickly separated. Such was the man who, on his father's descent into madness, became Prince Regent of the United Kingdom, with the duties, but not yet the status of a king. The great cartoonist had a field day with his shape and his private life. Posterity, on the whole, hasn't been much kinder. But George did instinctively understand the cohesive power of ceremony and display. Once again, it all goes back to the French Revolution. Burke's final prophecy to the French had been that some popular general would arise and become the master of your whole republic. This prediction was fulfilled by the meteoric rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in an extraordinary ceremony held in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The event set new standards for pomp and precision, which the established monarchies rushed to copy. The Republic had been bad enough for the Prince of Wales, but this upstart emperor was far worse, and doing him down and outdoing him became, insofar as the prince's easygoing personality allowed, an obsession. The Prince Regent had over a decade to wait, but then, on the 18th of June, 1815, at Waterloo, to the south of Brussels, Napoleon engaged with the British army commanded by Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. Each side played to their strengths. The French attacked with brio. The British doggedly resisted in defensive formation. "Let's see who can pound longest," said Wellington. In the event, the British did, holding out until the arrival of the Prussian Allied army gave them an overwhelming advantage. On the 6th of July, the Allies entered Paris, and on the 13th, Napoleon wrote the most remarkable letter of his life. It was addressed to the Prince Regent. Altesse Royale, Royal Highness, it began.
I have terminated my political career. I put myself under the protection of British laws, which I entreat of your Royal Highness as from the most powerful, the most constant, and the most generous of my foes.
In this contest of the imperial eagle and the royal popinjay, the popinjay, it seemed, had won. But even in defeat, Napoleon's vision for France continued to fascinate his enemies, and none more so than the Prince Regent. It began with a contest of capitals, London versus Paris. Like many despots, Napoleon was a megalomaniac builder who started to refashion the then largely medieval warren of Paris into the worthy capital of an empire which at its height stretched from the Bay of Biscay to the gates of Moscow. This was to throw down the gauntlet to Britain, since London, fattened by overseas empire and trade, already dwarfed Paris in size and wealth. Now, Prinny decided, the city must look the part. The man charged with realising his dreams was John Nash. Nash's brief was simple. He must outdo Napoleonic Paris. And, thanks to his unusual combination of qualities as both visionary architect and shrewd property developer, he largely succeeded. His scheme, which involved both landscaping and town planning on an heroic scale, created a grand processional route from the newly laid out Regent's Park in the north to Pall Mall and the gates of the Prince's London residence in the south, long since, alas, demolished. Nash worked in sweeping curves and artful vistas, whilst his buildings, which were really terraces of upper-middle-class brick houses, were covered in stucco plaster and painted to look like a succession of noble palaces. This is architecture as urban stage set, as theatrical as Napoleon's coronation, and as successful. In 1820, there arrived the day for which the prince had waited almost as eagerly as for Napoleon's downfall. For almost a decade after he became regent, his father, King George III, had lived the life of a recluse here at Windsor in a little three-roomed apartment. Dead to the world, he spent hours thumping on an old harpsichord, but his condition suddenly worsened, and he died on the 29th of January. The regent was now king at last, and he was determined that everybody should know it. His coronation, delayed for over a year by his disastrously misjudged attempt to divorce his estranged wife, Caroline, finally took place on the 19th of July, 1821. It was, he resolved, to be the best organised and most magnificent in British history. It was certainly the most expensive, costing almost £250,000, whilst his father's had been done for less than 10,000. This is Sir George Naylor's The Coronation of His Most Sacred Majesty, King George IV. It was undertaken at His Majesty's especial command, and it received a £3,000 royal subsidy, because it had to be the best, or at any rate, better than Napoleon's. Napoleon had commissioned a history of his coronation, and George was not going to be outshone. Indeed, he was measuring himself against the emperor, literally since his tailor had been sent to Paris to copy Napoleon's coronation robe. The result imitates Napoleon's, but being even more thickly embroidered and befurred, it took 8 page boys to carry it. But there was more to this than the clash of 2 monstrous egos, for George's coronation, with its more than Napoleonic magnificence, was a triumphant reaffirmation that the British monarchy had survived 2 of the greatest threats to its existence: the ideological challenge of the French Revolution and the military threat of Napoleon to emerge once more as the arbiter of Europe and the only world power. Burke's vision of monarchy as an integral part of national identity was being triumphantly realised. One of the spectators at the coronation was the Scottish historian and novelist Sir Walter Scott, who was bowled over by the combination of gay, gorgeous and antique dress which floated before the eye. Profoundly influenced by Burke, Scott's writing was steeped in history and tradition. Scott, who'd first met George in 1815, was given the opportunity to turn his fiction into the reality, if that's the right word, of a grand historical pageant when he was put in charge of organising the King's visit to Edinburgh in 1822. The visit, the first to Scotland by a reigning monarch since Charles II's coronation as King of Scots in 1651, began at Leith on the 14th of August with the King's ceremonial landing. At Edinburgh Castle, George inspected the Scottish regalia, which had been recently unearthed by Scott himself. Throughout his stay, at Scott's insistence, all the gentlemen wore Highland dress, including the King, whose ample figure was compressed into something like the necessary shape by corsets and flesh-coloured tights. The climax came with a great banquet held in the Parliament House, where, a century earlier, Scotland's separate political existence had been extinguished by the passage of the Act of Union. The King called for a toast to the clans and chieftains of Scotland, to which the chief of Clan MacGregor replied with one, to the chief of chiefs, the King. It was all, as the hard-headed have not ceased to point out, from then till now, nonsense. But, thanks to Scott's genius as an impresario, it was inspired, romantic nonsense. Above all, it was successful nonsense. It gave Scotland a proud cultural identity that, for over 100 years, dwelt in a sort of parallel universe to the political subordination required by the Union. And, as the ardently Tory Scot intended, it firmly anchored this renewed Scots national identity to the British monarchy and the Hanoverian dynasty. George IV's taste for theatrical pageantry harnessed and domesticated the wild horses of nationalism unleashed by the French Revolution. For that, parading through the streets of Edinburgh in corsets and a kilt was a small price to pay. George IV was unable to keep up the flurry of activity which marked the beginning of his reign. His health and mobility declined, and his self-indulgence grew as he washed down vast amounts of food with even larger quantities of alcohol. He died unlamented at Windsor on the 26th of June, 1830, and was succeeded by his eldest surviving brother, William, Duke of Clarence. At first sight, William IV, who was already aged 64, was not a promising prospect as king. After early service in the Royal Navy, whither he'd been packed off at the age of only 13, he'd spent most of his life as a relatively impecunious younger son. He was also personally ridiculous, with a strange, pineapple-shaped head and a tendency to talk, at length, and at some distance from the point. On the other hand, he was a moderate in politics, in contrast to the rabid Toryism of other members of the royal family, whilst his naval service had given him both a common touch as well as robust common sense. He was also in striking contrast to his predecessor, completely indifferent, even hostile to pomp and circumstance. This, for instance, is Clarence House, the elegant but comparatively modest London residence built for William whilst he was still heir to the throne. The king continued to live here after his accession and showed no wish at all to move into the neighbouring Buckingham Palace, George IV's last and grandest building project, which he'd failed to complete. Impatient on one occasion at the delays in getting the state coach ready for the dissolution of Parliament, William threatened to go in a hackney carriage, the ancestor of the modern taxi. Never, in short, has Britain come nearer to a bicycling, or at any rate, to a taxiing monarchy than under William IV. But would these decent, unpretentious qualities be enough? Barely a month after William's accession, there came a brutal reminder of the fate of unsuccessful sovereigns. Paris rose in the days of July. The King of France, whose monarchy had been restored after the fall of Napoleon, was ignominiously driven from his throne. William reluctantly allowed the French king, Charles X, to stay in Edinburgh. But just how secure was his own throne? For, despite 40-odd years of almost uninterrupted Tory rule, ideas from France had taken root in Britain. But would they result in revolution or in reform? For even radicals thought change could be brought about within Britain's existing institutions and by peaceful means, not revolutionary violence. The striking thing is that the target of their agitation was not the monarchy, as it was in contemporary France and had been in 17th century England, but Parliament. In the early 19th century, Parliament met in the medieval royal palace of Westminster, which had long been abandoned by the monarchy and handed over to the Lords, the House of Commons, and the law courts. The result was a kind of physical embodiment of Burke's ancient constitution, the buildings almost imperceptibly altered and adapted over centuries. It was also ramshackle, jerry-built, and prone to fire. Much the same could be said by its critics of the House of Commons itself. Many important and fast-growing towns had no MP at all, whilst tiny, half-inhabited villages returned 2 MPs each at the command of the owner of the rotten borough, as such constituencies were known. A handful of rich and powerful noblemen owned a dozen or so such rotten boroughs each and could make and break governments. It was William's misfortune that the pressure for parliamentary reform suddenly intensified at the beginning of his reign. For, 5 months after his accession, the Tory government fell and a Whig administration took office for the first time in almost 50 years. Over the next 2 years, 3 reform bills were submitted to Parliament. The first was defeated in the Commons and provoked a general election which, even on the unreformed franchise, produced a Whig landslide. The second was defeated in the House of Lords, and it looked as though the intransigent Tory majority in the Lords would do the same to the third. The only way, it seemed, to break the deadlock was for William to create enough peers to give the Whigs a majority in the Lords as well. So far, William had given the Prime Minister, Earl Grey, his unstinting support. He did so on practical grounds, since he saw that reform was the only alternative to revolution. But he also acted on principle, since he saw it as his duty, whatever his personal wishes, to support the Prime Minister of the day so long as he kept the confidence of Parliament.
But the creation of up to 50 peers, which would radically dilute the composition of the Lords, was a step too far. William refused. Grey resigned, and on the 9th of May 1832, the King invited the Tories to form a government. There had been rioting the year before, but now England had its days of May, when it looked as though London and other cities would follow in the steps of revolutionary Paris. There were mass demonstrations and strikes. In Birmingham, a speaker at a rally proclaimed Tory incompetency to govern and invoked the people's right to arm in the face of oppression. When the American rebels had used language like that, George III had dug his heels in. William IV instead sought compromise.
Why didn't the Tories simply abstain? He suggested privately. After all, reform was inevitable, and that way they would at least retain their inbuilt majority in the Lords. But it was a bitter pill to swallow, and the Tories resisted as long as possible.
Finally, the Tories, led by the Duke of Wellington, had to admit they couldn't form a government. William now had no choice but to recall Grey and to agree in writing to his demand for the mass creation of peers.
It was the most humiliating document a king had signed since the Civil War. But William turned it to his advantage by informing the Tory leaders of what he'd done. Certain now that they'd be swamped, even in the Lords, they abandoned their resistance, and the Reform Bill went through. On the 7th of June, the Reform Act received the royal assent, but in William's absence. Grey had wanted him to give the assent in person, but William, because he disapproved of the popular clamour, refused. It was perhaps his only false step in the whole affair.
Unencumbered by such doubts, the first House of Commons, returned under the Reform Act, had itself proudly memorialised. Two years later, on the night of the 16th of October 1834, the chambers of both Houses of Parliament and all the rest of the Palace of Westminster, apart from the Great Hall, were consumed by a raging fire. Reconstructing Parliament from scratch now ceased to be a disputed metaphor and became instead a practical necessity. King William IV did not long survive the Reform Act and the fire. Now in his late 60s, his health was declining and his tetchiness increasing.
He was kept going only by his determination to live long enough to make sure that his detested sister-in-law, the Duchess of Kent, did not become regent on behalf of her young daughter, Victoria, who, in view of William's own failure to father a legitimate child, was heiress presumptive to the throne.
William made it with days to spare. Victoria celebrated her 18th birthday, her royal coming of age, on the 24th of May, 1837, and William, his goal achieved, died 20-odd days later, on the 20th of June.
Victoria was at Kensington Palace when her uncle died, and it was here, in these rooms, that she'd been brought up and educated. Her education was strong in foreign languages and traditional female accomplishments like drawing and music, at which Victoria excelled. But it had neglected the more rigorous male curriculum of classics and mathematics.
However, Victoria would be no meekly submissive woman. Her governess had brought her up to rule, and Victoria had the appetite and the will for the necessary hard work.
The news that she was queen was brought at 6 o'clock in the morning by the Lord Chamberlain and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Victoria, who'd been roused from her sleep, received them in her dressing gown. The contrast between the glowing young queen and the somberly dressed, elderly male political establishment was only reinforced at her accession council,
which was held later the same day, also in Kensington Palace, in the Red Saloon. Particularly susceptible was the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, and the attraction was mutual. Charming, worldly wise, and with the faint whiff of danger of the ex-roue, Melbourne was the perfect mentor for the inexperienced young Queen. He was also of the right political colour, since Victoria had been brought up as an ardent Whig.
Victoria's open partiality for Melbourne and her blatant political partisanship caused a constitutional crisis only 2 years after her accession, when the Tories tried to form a government and Victoria wrecked their chances. Even Whigs now had to admit that a young, unmarried girl on the throne was a loose cannon.
Who would make a suitable husband for the young Queen Victoria? The frontrunner was Prince Albert, second son of the Duke of Saxe-Coburg, a little principality in Germany. When Victoria, who was highly susceptible to male beauty, had first met Albert some years previously, she'd been very taken by his excellent figure and rather ethereal good looks. Excellently educated as well, Albert was the very model of a modern prince. All that he lacked was a wife. But Victoria seemed in no hurry to oblige. She was enjoying the delicious freedom of being a young reigning monarch, far too much for that. Nevertheless, despite her conspicuous lack of encouragement, Albert was sent over to England to be inspected a second time.
He arrived at Windsor on the 10th of October, 1839. Victoria was watching from the top of the stairs, and she confided her feelings to her diary. It was with some emotion that I beheld Albert, who is beautiful, she wrote with her characteristically heavy underlining. It was love at second sight. It was nonetheless real for that, and it lasted for both their lives.
In view of the disparity of their status, it was Victoria who had to propose. They were married at the Chapel Royal at St James's on the 10th of February 1840 and departed for a 2-day honeymoon at Windsor. We didn't sleep much, Victoria noted of their wedding night. Soon they were revelling in each other's sensuality. Albert helped Victoria pull on her stockings. She watched him shaving. Unsurprisingly, Victoria conceived within days and gave birth to a daughter in November. A son, Edward, Prince of Wales, came 11 months later, followed by 7 more children, with never more than 2 years between them. And it was this wedded bliss which began to alter their relationship. From the beginning, they had had adjacent desks, but Victoria made clear that, as was constitutionally proper, the business of queening was hers. Albert was only allowed to blot her dispatches. But her repeated pregnancies, regularly followed by intense postnatal depression, began to swing the balance of power, and the change was completed by Albert's increasing psychological dominance.
She was tempestuous, he coldly rational, and he soon turned her temperament against her by making her ashamed of her uninhibited behaviour. The result was that Victoria not only became a submissive wife in private, she even surrendered public business to her husband as well, who acted as her private secretary, but with more power than any private secretary ever had. Once he'd blotted her dispatches. Now he dictated them.
This left Albert a free hand to shape his own vision of monarchy. He'd arrived in a Britain transformed by the Reform Act, which had created a new, predominantly middle-class electorate. and he quickly attached himself to the most intelligent politician of the mid-century, the Tory leader, Sir Robert Peel. Peel, himself the son of a cotton manufacturer, saw it as his mission to adapt the Tory party to the new world of industry, powerful manufacturing cities and bourgeois morality, which we call the Industrial Revolution. Peel failed and split his party rather than converting it. Albert succeeded in adapting the monarchy to the same forces beyond anyone's wildest dreams. He began at home. This is Osborne, the seaside holiday house built by Albert on the Isle of Wight. The contrast with the Prince Regent's Brighton Pavilion couldn't have been greater. In place of the fantastic architecture and fantastic cost overruns, all was sobriety and efficiency. The site was bought at a bargain price and the building works completed to time and to budget. The layout was innovatory. Servants and the business of state were shunted off to the household wing on the left, while the family pavilion provided the setting for the home life of our dear Queen, which was really Albert's creation, a model of modern, almost bourgeois privacy and respectability.
That damned morality will undo us all, snorted Victoria's first old-school Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. Albert, on the contrary, saw the moral monarchy as the one means by which royalty could appeal to the new middle classes, perhaps even lead them.
Albert, who had a seemingly limitless interest in technology and technical education, grasped the opportunity to promote Britain's manufacturing role in the world when he was invited to be President of the Society for the Encouragement of Arts and Manufactures. The Society conceived the idea of an international exhibition, but it took all Albert's drive and determination to overcome the objections. The crowds would riot. The fine elm trees on the Hyde Park site would be damaged. None of the 245 submitted designs for an exhibition building would work. The day was saved by Joseph Paxton's scheme for a prefabricated crystal palace of iron and glass, like a gigantic conservatory. Albert took only 9 days to get the most advanced building of the 19th century accepted. 4 months later, it was completed.
On the 1st of May, 1851, Victoria, wearing silver and pink, and with Albert standing at her side, opened the Great Exhibition. It was the greatest day in our history, she wrote, and the triumph of my beloved Albert.
The statistics are staggering. The palace was 1,848 feet long, 108 feet high, easily accommodating the threatened elms, and covered in 300,000 panes of glass. Inside, 16 acres of exhibition space displayed 100,000 exhibits from 14,000 exhibitors drawn from Europe and the world. And it was visited by 6 million people, or a third of Britain's entire population.
8 months later, on the 3rd of February, 1852, Victoria and Albert opened another, very different building. Indeed, at first sight, it looks as reactionary as the Crystal Palace was progressive.
For, when the rules were announced for a competition to rebuild the Palace of Westminster after the fire of 1834, it was specified that the design must be in the Gothic or Elizabethan style. Classicism was out of the question, tainted by its association with the Republican idea of the French Revolution. Every inch of the palace is covered in a riot of medievally inspired ornament. Especially rich is the sequence of magnificent spaces designed as the stage set for the state opening of Parliament. Albert was heavily involved as chairman of the committee which chose the artists and the subjects for the wall paintings. Under Albert's guidance, only British subjects were chosen. Mythological, like Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, in the royal robing room. Or historical, like the best painting in the sequence, the gigantic, heroic death of Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar in the huge Royal Gallery. The sequence of rooms culminates in the gilded splendours of the House of Lords. The layout and decorative scheme has been described and denounced as backward-looking and Tory.
Albert would have been astonished. He considered himself to be liberal, progressive, constitutionalist. He saw no contradiction between history and progress, or between the Crystal Palace and the Palace of Westminster. And he regarded the state opening of Parliament as the perfect reconciliation of medieval and modern, in which the institutions of English government showed themselves at once durable and flexible. And the monarchy, under his, Albert's guidance, most of all.
But only a decade later, Albert was dead, worn out with overwork. His vision of monarchy marching hand in hand with a middle-class electorate didn't long survive him. The franchise widened twice more, but Victoria had little respect for public opinion and was firm that she would never be queen of a democracy. Thus, by the dawn of the 20th century, advancing modernity threatened yet again to outstrip the Crown's ability to keep pace with a changing world. To survive, monarchy would have to reinvent itself once more.